To begin with, we acknowledge the owners of the lands from which we all come, their elders, past and present. We also acknowledge the wisdom keepers, the light keepers, the people who've brought these medicines forward since the beginning of humanity to help raise our consciousness, to heal us, and just to help us to be here today. We need these medicines probably more than we've ever needed them in this world, which is so divided and so oppressed. And so it's a real honour for us to have Hamilton with us today. We're going to start off, well, firstly, I'm just going to have a look at the gallery and see who's new. We always ask this question. So who is new? Who's not been on an MMA webinar before? Hands up, just wait on. Great, cool. Welcome to all of you. For those that have been on our webinars before, quite a lot of people, we're just going to show a short video about MMA. For those that have seen it before, we hope you don't mind seeing it again, and we hope that all of you will share it. And then we're going to show a couple of introductory slides. Then I'm going to start the conversation with Hamilton. We'll be welcoming your questions all along the way, and we may answer your questions as they crop up as well in this particular session today. So Alan, we'll start off with a short video, please.
Did you know that over 45% of Australians will experience mental illness in their lifetime? That's nearly half of us.
Everything feels flat and grey. Sleep and don't like it. I feel ashamed.
Mental ill health devastates lives and families and costs Australians around $60 billion a year. Research and treatment expenses continue to rise, yet rates of mental illness indicate that we're losing the battle. New approaches are urgently needed to address this immense suffering and cost. Psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is currently being trialled worldwide and has demonstrated remarkable promise in treating depression, anxiety, addiction, and post-traumatic stress disorder, with new trials underway for treatment of dementia and anorexia. The treatment combines a short program of psychotherapy with just a few medicinal doses of psilocybin or Mdma. In the 1950s and 60s, psychedelic treatments had a major impact in psychiatry, and many considered it the next big thing in mental health treatment. But for political reasons, the Nixon administration criminalised the use of psychedelics and effectively stopped all research. That research has finally begun again. With proper clinical support, psychedelic treatments are safe and frequently lead to remission after only a short program, and even where current treatments have failed. Here at Mind Medicine Australia, we believe everyone should have access to the best treatments for mental illness. We will seek to establish best practice in regulated psychedelic-assisted treatment. Mind Medicine Australia is wholly focused on the clinical application of psychedelic medicines. We're preparing for change by developing therapist training, ethical guidelines, a centre of excellence in psychedelic medicine, educational material and events, and supporting clinical research. We're a small organisation doing big things, and we need your support. Please share this video and visit our website to support us and get involved.
So yeah, we'd love you to share that video far and wide. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll just show a couple of quick slides for those of you who are new to Mind Medicine, just to tell you why we exist, what we're doing, and so on. So next slide, thank you, Alan. And we, of course, are focused on the clinical use of these medicines, and we are recording this session. And we have a YouTube platform where you can watch this recording and share it with others as well. Next slide, thank you. Next slide. So we're at a stage at the moment where we have this massive mental health epidemic. Pre-COVID, these were the statistics: 1 in 5 Australian adults with a mental illness, 1 in 8 on antidepressants, including 1 in 4 older Australians and kids as young as 4 on antidepressants. These figures have exacerbated enormously over the past 18 months. It was recently suggested in the Australian newspaper that 4 out of 5 Australians are now suffering with some kind of mental illness or have diminished mental health since this crisis. So we have a real challenge on our hands. Next slide, thank you. The elephant in the room is the lack of innovation in treatments for mental illness for over 50 years. So you can see there the elephant's trying to get the attention of the bureaucrats and others. So what we have is a situation where there's a lot of new patient access gateways recommended. People are suggesting more telehealth sessions, training more therapists and so on. But if we can't get to the root cause of a person suffering, they're not going to get better. And they're going to either stay in the system and clog it up, which means enormous long waiting lists, which is what we have at the moment in some parts of Australia, including in Melbourne. The wait list to see a psychiatrist or psychologist is in many cases over a year, and in regional parts of Australia over 2 years. Now, if you're seriously mentally unwell, that's completely unsustainable. But worse than that, of course, is that people who are not in the system and can't get into the system, drop out altogether, and that can lead to a slippery slope and suicide. Next slide, thank you. So here you can see, Ilan, I see a little square on my slide. I'm just wondering if it's just my screen or hopefully it's not. Okay.
I don't have anything blocking my screen.
Okay, all right. No, I think it's just me then. All right, I'll move it to the right. So in the case of depression, only 30 to 35% of sufferers experience remission from current treatments and or psychotherapy. And of course, the side effects are significant. In the case of post-traumatic stress disorder, as few as 5 to 10% of patients experience remission from existing treatments. So we do need innovation in this space, and we need it now. Next slide, thank you. So my husband and I, Peter Hunt, and I set up Mind Medicine Australia in early 2019. So we've been going for pretty much 3 years now, non-stop, to expand the treatment options available to medical practitioners and their patients through setting up safe and effective psychedelic-assisted treatments to cure a range of mental illnesses. Our focus at the moment has been on psilocybin and Mdma because they're most advanced in the clinical trials around the world. But today we have the great benefit of having Hamilton Morris with us, who's an expert in a number, I think probably all the different psychedelics. If any of you saw Hamilton's pharmacopoeia, you'll know that. So there'll be an opportunity today for you to ask about some of the other psychedelic substances as well. For us, though, success means that these therapies become an integral part of our mental health system, so that if you go to a medical practitioner and you're feeling depressed or suffering with trauma, they'll give you a choice of different options, including existing treatments like antidepressants or psychotherapy, but also offer you the option of psychedelic-assisted therapy, with full disclosure on the risks and benefits of all treatments. Also, we will continue to hopefully see the incredibly high remission rates that we've been seeing in over 160 trials around the world that have taken place so far. And these remission rates have been between 60 to 80% after just 2 to 3 medicinal doses with a short course of psychotherapy. So as you can see, that is way in excess of the current remission rates from existing treatments. And of course, our goal is that these are accessible and affordable to all Australians, regardless of where they're based or their financial circumstances. Next slide, thanks. So, as I mentioned, 2 to 3 dose sessions in contrast to, for many people, what is a lifetime of use of antidepressants or antipsychotics or other pharmacotherapy, which has significant side effects. These medicines are considered curative. They're not just managing an illness, they're actually getting people well and out of the system. And they're considered extremely safe in medically controlled environments and non-addictive. Both have been granted breakthrough therapy designation by the Food and Drug Administration in the US. And that therapy designation is only given very rarely to medicines that could be vastly superior to existing treatments to fast track the approval process. So what effectively happens is that when the medicines go through phase 3 trials, if those trials are successful and continue to reinforce the results achieved in phase 2 trials, then the medicines do become instantly prescribable. Next slide, thanks. So I'm sure Hamilton would be able to talk about this slide as well, and Hamilton, feel free to jump in once I've spoken about this. But I love this slide. You know, really we're talking about this incredible communication that starts to occur between different brain networks. And with these medicines, it's said by many of the researchers in this space that these medicines help to bypass the default mode network of our brain. The default mode network of our brain keeps us defaulting to old patterns and programs and rigid and stuck styles of thinking. And even if we don't have a mental illness, generally we're thinking in much more rigid thought structures than, say, when we were a child. But many of our thought structures, of course, are formed in childhood, and they can be very difficult to break out of. And you can see there the results that are depicted in representations of fMRI scans. So the placebo on the right, which shows, very limited and stuck neural connectivity. The hemispheres of the brain are not really talking to one another very well at all. In the one on the left, you have the ingestion of the psilocybin, this massive neurogenesis that occurs, this increased neuroplasticity, as the patient experiences this much greater sense of connectivity with self, with others, with the planet, a sense of oneness, a sense of being part of everything and everything being part of you. And this is the great gift of psilocybin. It provides this therapeutic window in which then a trained therapist can work with a patient to help them break out of their stuck styles of thinking and to become agents for their own healing. Now, there's the same amount of lines in both those circles. And many researchers and doctors, indeed, in this space describe what happens here as resetting or rebooting the brain. That it's like defragging the dodgy drive. If your computer's playing up, you just can't get it working. It's very slow. It seems to be corrupt. And then all of a sudden, you switch it off, you switch it on, you have a blank slate. It's all working perfectly again. I don't know, Hamilton, if you want to comment on this, or I'm sure you will during our conversation. Did you want to say anything about this particular slide or the 5-TH2A receptor and psilocybin and anything like that?
I mean, I could say any number of things about it. I don't know. So, if anyone has a specific question, I'm happy to answer it.
Great. Well,
or we can talk about this research as well. I mean, yeah. whatever you.
Yeah, well, we'll come to that in the Q&A, I'm sure, and we welcome people to ask questions. So the next slide, please, Ilan. Great. So what we're seeing around the world is this massive momentum that's building. We're seeing new trials now underway for treatment of dementia and also anorexia and eating disorders, a whole range of addictions, Parkinson's, stroke, schizophrenia, even interest in that space now. Fibromyalgia, cluster headaches. It's really very exciting to think about the potential uses, therapeutic uses for these medicines. We're also seeing regulatory schemes around the world, including in Australia, that are compassionate use special access schemes, where a doctor can get an approval on a case-by-case basis for a patient who's treatment resistant for either psilocybin or MDMA-assisted therapy. And in Australia, over 40 practitioners have been granted access through our federal regulator, the TGA, for these treatments. But we still have state barriers that prevent the medicines from being brought into states to actually treat those patients, many of whom are suicidal. We're working really hard to try and get a national standardised system in Australia to recognise these substances as medicines. And that's why we've put in rescheduling applications to the TGA. And the TGA has just announced, has just published an independent review of both psilocybin and MDMA. And in December, they'll make a final decision on rescheduling of psilocybin and MDMA from Schedule 9, which is prohibited substance, which these medicines should never have been scheduled in, to Schedule 8, controlled medicine. So still people wouldn't get to take the medicines home, but at least there'll be an opportunity for people to be treated on a case-by-case basis. And of course, once these medicines become approved in the US, and the TGA will follow suit in Australia. We've also worked with the federal government in Australia, which recently announced a $15 million grant for further research in this space. So that's the largest federal grant of any nation in the world. Furthermore, we're seeing states around the world, like Oregon in the US, starting to legalise psilocybin for therapeutic use. Also the Canadian government, which is also legalising psilocybin use for terminally ill patients and some patients with PTSD. Next slide, thank you. And this is just two of the recent trials that have taken place, very significant trials. The first Imperial College trial that directly compared 2 doses of psilocybin with a short course of psychotherapy against 6 weeks of a daily ingestion of escitalopram, a leading SSRI antidepressant, alongside a short course of psychotherapy. So the psilocybin group had twice as many remissions, had less side effects and less suicidal ideation. So it was incredible results there. And then in the MAPS phase 3 trial results, immediately after 3 MDMA assisted therapy sessions with a short course of psychotherapy, 67% of patients no longer qualified for a PTSD diagnosis. 88% experienced clinical meaningful reductions in their symptoms. It's expected that with further integration, that potentially up to 80% of patients in this phase 3 trial, the first part of it, will go into remission. Part 2 of this phase 3 trial is taking place currently, and it's expected that MDMA could be prescribable in the US within the next 12 to 18 months, which is really exciting. Next slide, thank you. So finally, before this conversation with Hamilton, I just want to say, you know, we're building the ecosystem in Australia to make these medicines available and accessible to all those who need them and who are suffering. This will take time, but we're making a lot of headway. Our key strategic pillars are awareness and knowledge building. So like today, this global webinar series, but also other webinars that we do in partnerships with clinics, insurers, hospitals, universities, businesses and others. So if any of you are on this call and want to have a presentation, you know, by us or some of the psychologists or psychiatrists who are on our advisory panel, please let us know and we'd be happy to come and present to your organisation. We really want to make sure that people understand the data and science behind these medicines. We also have our global summit in November, which Hamilton and like literally the leaders in this space are speaking at. Ilan, do you have that slide about to show that who's speaking about it? I'll get you to show that next. Just hold on. There they are. Amazing, incredible people. And we're thrilled to give you a special code today, MMA 2021. If you want to get some tickets for this summit or our 2-day introductory workshop. And Hamilton's also speaking on this. This slide's going to be updated very shortly. We should also announce that Roland Griffiths has just confirmed that he's now wanting to speak at the summit as well. He's one of our wonderful ambassadors, and he'll be also presenting at the summit in addition to this incredible lineup. Just going back to that slide again, the strategy slide, please, Ilan. And so we also have started chapters all around Australia, and they're in major capital cities and regional areas to further really build awareness, educate local communities, run events and raise funds towards this movement. So if you want to join a chapter or start a chapter, please reach out. We've also started the first ever certificate in psychedelic assisted therapies in the world. Not on the world, but sorry, in the Southern Hemisphere. What am I talking about? And that's a 4-month part-time program for psychiatrists, psychologists, GPs, psychotherapists, counsellors, nurses, paramedics, physicians, emergency, palliative care, addiction specialists, occupational therapists, social workers, and so on. All our intakes have been full so far. We have 4 intakes in 2022. If you're a therapist on this call, please, I encourage you to register. There's some of our graduates from that course. We've nearly completed 2 intakes now of the course, and many of the people doing the training describe it as the best professional development training they've done, as a rite of passage. Some of them describe it as life-changing. It's pretty exciting. We're also looking at setting up an Asia Pacific Centre for Emerging Mental Health Therapies in partnership with unis in Australia for further research and development in this space, development of the medicines, manufacturing of the medicines in Australia and other supply chains. We're looking at clinical rollouts and, of course, the preferred legal and ethical frameworks. But with that, I'll just go to the next quick slide, which really just talks about, thank you, Ilan. You know, our webinars are free, but we are a charity. We do all of our work my husband and I, for free, and we donate money towards this cause because we want to alleviate the immense suffering in this world. And we encourage all of you to help us. Small or large, every single gift makes a difference. And we couldn't do this alone. We have like probably over 200 supporters who are helping us, but that's not enough because this is a huge mission. And we want to make sure that these medicines can be accessible to all Australians, not just the wealthy. So with that, we're going to stop the share and we're going to start this conversation with Hamilton. And I'm going to start off, Hamilton, by just asking you how you got into this field to begin with. Like, what was it that made you really interested in psychedelics?
I mean, it's kind of a hard question to answer because I think I've been interested in psychedelics for as long as I've been aware of them. I mean, since I was a child, really, because even if you haven't tried them, they're very interesting. Just the idea of them is interesting.
Yes.
Other types of drugs operate on axes that are more familiar to typical experience, like stimulants. Most people know what it feels like to be stimulated, or sedatives. People know what it's like to sleep. But for most people, they can't have an experience like the experience that a psychedelic provides without a psychedelic. I know that people will argue that meditation or various spiritual practices could take you to the same place, and I'll have to take those people's word for it because I certainly have not been able to achieve such states in any other way. So yeah, I think they're pretty interesting. I'm more surprised when people aren't interested in them.
And you, I mean, with your wonderful program, Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia, did you actually try all those medicines yourself?
Did I try
all the different medicines that you speak about in your program?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, you know, I'm sure.
I think it would be irresponsible to report on these subjects without personal experience.
Absolutely.
It's crucial to understanding them.
Yeah. And what do you feel like at this stage in humanity, you know, where humanity is certainly suffering a lot at the moment, why do you think these medicines have so much potential to help us at this stage in particular?
Well, I agree that things are pretty bad right now. I'm very worried about the state of the world. And, at least in the United States, there were more drug overdoses in 2020 than any other year in history. And it seems like there will be more again this year. And I've just seen an unfathomable amount of death and suffering in the last couple of years, and I am not alone in that. So, I think everyone is looking for something that will make the world better. Whether psychedelics can solve all or any of these problems, I don't know. But I think that the arsenal of psychiatric drugs that are currently available certainly don't seem to be fixing the problems very effectively. They work for some people, but even the people they work for are often a little bit unsatisfied. And so, yeah, if there's improvement to be had, I think that it's worth pursuing. And not to mention, people losing their freedom and going to prison as a result of the illegality of these substances, which is, at least in the United States, tied in with the concept that they have no medical use, at least in the wording of the law.
Yeah, which is, pretty sad when you think that was entirely a political decision.
Sorry, say that again?
Well, which is pretty sad when you consider that was entirely a political decision. It wasn't based on science. No,
it was not based on science. Few things are, unfortunately, so that's not so surprising. But yeah, it was a big mistake, and I think that what we're doing right now is starting to figure it out, starting to take the first steps to learning what these things can and can't do. And I'm constantly getting these questions like, do you think psychedelics can treat X disorder? And the honest answer is, I don't know. I've seen indications, strong indications that psychedelics can be used for an absurd number of different applications, like, everything ranging from Andrew Weil reporting that he lost his cat allergies permanently as a result.
Oh my God, I'd like to do that. Sorry, did he really?
Yes. Yeah. He really claims that he once had terrible cat allergies, and then on LSD, he played with a cat and psychologically undid his allergic response. I mean,
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And you have, you have all these strange papers from the 50s and 60s, people using LSD to treat psoriasis, things like that. Things that, you think, like, was that actually a good treatment? Did we just miss out on a really good psoriasis treatment for that? I think that there's all sorts of potential applications, and, if people have the freedom to do the research and the interest is there and the funding is there, I think we're going to answer a lot of these long-standing questions.
Mm-hmm. No, look, it's fantastic. And in terms of the chemistry of these substances, and we there's a lot of questions coming onto the chat, and we'll go to some of them in a moment. But in terms of the chemistry of these substances, do you want to talk a little bit to everyone about how you believe these substances work in the brain? I mean, we showed that chart. And to Vivian's question, did you see Vivian's question there, Hamilton? I just wanted to read it out. She said, I've mentioned that psychedelics cause neurogenesis. That's what I've been taught, but maybe I'm wrong. So she said here, they actually elicit neuroconnectivity. Yes, indeed, Vivian, they do. That connectivity is state dependent during the effects of the psychedelics, not permanent, which happens with neurogenesis. Did you want to comment on that for a moment, and then also talk a little more about the chemistry of these substances and how you think they're working in the brain as a chemist?
Sure. And to be clear, a chemist has no idea how they're working in the brain. That's not the realm of chemistry, unfortunately. Or actually, fortunately, I would say. But since at least since the publication of the Doors of Perception, people have always thought they understood how psychedelics are working in the brain. Aldous Huxley had some kind of hypothesis about glucose metabolism in the brain or something like that, and then people come up with a new explanation based on a different instrument every decade. And it's so is it disruption of the default mode network? Is it neurogenesis? Is it any number of potential neurological explanations? I don't know. That's most of the level that I look at these things is synthetically, like the molecules themselves, and then how they bind to human 5-HT2A receptors and what kind of functional activity they have at that receptor. So it's like a much more simplified system than the entirety of the human brain.
Yes. And with the 5-HT2A receptor, not everyone on this call understands what that is and does. Would you just like to explain that briefly?
Yeah. So, serotonin was discovered in the, 40s or 50s, and then you find serotonin receptors, and you find different subtypes of serotonin receptors, and you start to build some explanation of what contributions those different receptor subtypes might make to a different type of experience. So you have, serotonergic 5-HT2C agonists that are diet drugs, like lorcaserin. It was recently taken off the market in the United States, but this was this is a receptor that a lot of psychedelics bind to, but lorcaserin itself didn't seem to have any kind of, certainly not a desirable psychedelic type action. It had some psychoactivity, but I certainly didn't read any reports of actual like psychedelic type, like psilocybin type activity. So people have looked at all these different receptors, and it seems like the strongest evidence for if you were to name a single site of action for the classical serotonergic psychedelics, it would be the 5-HT2A receptor. That's the receptor that when it's blocked, it seems that psychedelic activity is also at the very least diminished, if not blocked entirely, depending on what reports you look at. So it's a strong candidate that has a lot of evidence behind it for being the the kind of primary site of action. There are all these other serotonin receptors that then modulate the experience in one direction or another, and that's something that's still being investigated, still not fully understood.
Okay, no, it's really interesting. And of course, that explains a little why. I mean, you might want to further enlarge on this, why it's important to wean yourself off antidepressants before you want to have some clinical effect from psychedelics. Did you want to just mention how that is important?
Sorry, I just keep looking at the chat window on the side and getting distracted.
No,
Sorry.
it's okay. We I promise we'll go to the chat.
Okay.
So just in terms of, a lot of people ask about how or why it's necessary to go off antidepressants and other pharmacological, Western medicines before you, for example, have psilocybin, because of the blocking of the receptors, etc.
Sorry, they're asking whether you should go off of an SSRI psychedelic before.
I mean, you have to. You have to with it. If you want to have an effect with psilocybin, as you know, then you have to be off antidepressants. But did you want to talk about just why that's the case?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the SSRIs increase the quantity of serotonin in the synaptic cleft, and over the course of months and years and decades, in some instances, there is some desensitization that occurs, and that can have an effect that diminishes the activity of psychedelics. Sometimes that effect is reversible. In some instances, it seems like the desensitization is long lasting. So it hasn't been very well studied. This is mostly from anecdotal reports of people that took SSRIs and then stopped and then started using psychedelics.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. And why do you think so many people are fearful about taking the medicines? I mean, apart from the political sort of, hatchet job that has been done on them, a lot of people, even when they know the science and the data, are very afraid of actually having these experiences. And in fact, in some of your programs, I recall seeing people who were, and I mean, certainly I was really afraid before I first took these medicines as well. But what do you think it is?
God, sorry, I need to remove the chat. It's going to kill me. So what was the question again?
No, the question was, why do you think so many people are fearful about taking the medicines, like in your programs?
Well, I think a lot of people are, concerned about their mental health and might think justifiably that they don't want to push themselves in any direction. Like, a lot of people exist in a state of, they want as much control as possible because it's so hard to control external circumstances of your life. But what you let into your body is one thing that you can control. And so I think people, like that control. They don't like the idea of losing control. And I think there's something to be said for that. If somebody feels that way, I don't want to try to force them to do anything they don't want. And I think people, sometimes these concerns are valid. So I don't want to go and say, anyone that's afraid of using psychedelics should just do it right now, because, sometimes, people have legitimate reasons. And I think, but one unfortunate thing about the fear is that it can color the experience itself, and I think that's something that happens in any kind of unregulated environment. There's so many people dying right now. Maybe you take a drug and you're afraid of it being laced with fentanyl, and the whole experience of consuming things in an unregulated environment right now is very filled with fear. That's a more like thing for this specific moment in the last couple of years. But people have a million reasons to be afraid. It's also not part of our culture. We've been, pretty much everyone has grown up hearing that they're bad, and so it's not really that surprising.
Absolutely. No, thank you. So I'm going to pick a couple of questions from the chat before we go back to some of the other questions you and I had spoken about. So people are asking, for example, about ASD and how this would help with neurodevelopmental disorders. Did you want to comment on that at all? I mean, you're a chemist, but you might want to comment on why you think that would be helpful, where we know the DMN connectivity to be significantly reduced compared to neurotypical brains.
Yeah, I don't know. Back to what I said earlier, where, you know, people have brought up so many different things. X disorder, will psychedelics help? And I could think of reasons why it would, and I could think of reasons why it wouldn't. And so, you know, that's my take on pretty much all of these things is, you know, if you think it's worth a try, I think people should investigate it. I think it should, you know, there's nothing, if it doesn't work,
nothing
then
to lose.
Yeah, we learned it doesn't work, and that's valuable in and of itself.
Absolutely. And look, for all of those asking some of those particular clinical questions on particular clinical conditions, we do have psychiatrists coming up on various webinars that we've got planned, and others who, and also other researchers and others who know more about that, who can answer more of those questions. There's also questions here about psychosis. Do you have any comment about, I mean, which psychedelics could be most advantageous? I just want to say to everyone that in the trials, there have been no cases whatsoever of psychosis occurring. But that's because people who do have psychotic conditions have generally been screened out. However, it has been suggested recently that bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder and schizophrenia can be potentially treated by these substances, and that's going to be a matter for researchers to do more work on, as Hamilton has suggested. But Hamilton, do you have any comment to make in regards to the psychosis? I mean, you obviously in your programs had a lot of patients, or not patients, I mean, people go through these treatments. Did you see anyone getting psychosis as a result?
No, like lasting clinical psychosis?
No, yeah, that's what I mean.
I did not know. But yeah, I didn't. That's not to say it couldn't happen, but I did not watch anyone have an experience that caused lasting disruptions of any kind.
Yeah, thank you. There's another one here on autism. Yeah, I mean, for this person, Annalie, you've asked lots of questions. Thank you so much. Annalie, we're certainly interested in, you know, other research in this space and supporting other research. So quite often out of these webinars, people contact us about research that they wish to do, and sometimes we support that, or we connect them to others who can support research. So we do encourage you to reach out to us with research ideas if you're researchers or clinicians out there that are doing that. Someone just mentioned, yeah, Paul Stamets' lofty stutter, very famously, similar to your cat discussion before.
Yeah, no, and again, it's a funny story. He lost his stutter, but it makes you wonder, is that an effect that other people could experience? Is that a potential application? So I think there's a lot to be discovered. A lot.
There's a question here about any comments about peyote. Did you want to make any, and San Pedro, would you like to comment at all about those plans? Because that's something we haven't spoken a lot about with MMA, because obviously they're not in the clinical trial so much at the moment. But people often ask us about mescaline and that sort of thing. So if you could talk a little bit about that and why you think they're such important psychedelics, I'd really appreciate it.
Yeah. I mean, peyote is a very beautiful plant for anyone that has seen it. It's has a kind of magnetism. It's really an amazing organism. And so it has also, of course, a very interesting history and chemistry. It's sort of the beginning of psychedelic chemistry, was the isolation of and characterization of peyote by Hefter. And in the United States, it has a long history. I think probably the oldest known artifacts related to the use of psychedelics are sort of peyote button effigies that are made out of peyote. It's like a peyote sculpture made out of peyote.
Wow.
Yeah, and I think these are something like, they might be 4,000 years old. They were found near the Rio Grande. And so, yeah, so a very long history. Obviously, it's core to the religious practices of the Huichol and the Native American Church. So also a very interesting religious history in the United States. I think probably the first instance of a psychedelic being made legal for religious purposes in the United States. And yeah, so there's a lot to say about it. And of course, the chemistry of it is so interesting as well. So yeah, and then compared to San Pedro or something like that, also interesting, different, also a very interesting history in South America, where, if you go to places like Huancabamba, there's like statues in the town square of a San Pedro shaman, that it's
Wow.
just such a part of their culture. And it's not at all, it's not, like in the way that like Iquitos or something has a lot of psychedelic tourism, and there's a kind of a reputation and a practice of taking really high doses of ayahuasca and kind of blasting off. What I think is interesting about the way that San Pedro is integrated into the culture of Huancabamba is they take lower doses of it, and it's just, that's the way it's done. It's not about blasting off into the cosmos and having some kind of transcendent experience. It's part of a cultural ritual where you drink essentially a low dose, really like a little above a threshold dose of mescaline containing tea. And then you chant, and there's rattles, and you're examined by the shaman, and that's that. And then you go back to your normal life. And it's kind of, I think it shows another way that these things can exist, where it's not so extreme. People think about psychedelics being integrated into a culture and think that it's going to have some kind of extreme 1960s type effect, where everyone is suddenly like starting cults or something because they're so blown away by the activity of the substance. But I think that something a little bit less dramatic than that is also possible. And whether that's good or bad, I don't know. But I think that it's an interesting place to see how it's part of their culture, but also it's just not a big deal.
It's absolutely fascinating. And just your knowledge in this space is just so extraordinary. Look, there's a question here, and I don't think this has been done, but Nat, I would be very curious if anybody has performed an fMRI on a patient with neurological deficit while in a psychedelic state. Do you know anything about that, Hamilton? This is from someone who had a spinal artery stroke.
Yeah, I am not aware of that having been done. There were some studies that were done with Ambien and people who had traumatic brain injuries that showed Ambien actually restoring activity in damaged parts of the brain.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some investigation starting in relation to stroke, and it makes sense. I mean, if you think about, that increased connectivity, it does make sense that would make a difference. And I certainly know some people who have used these medicines who've had strokes overseas, and they have been able to heal from their strokes quite effectively, obviously in combination with therapy as well. And also Anthony's asking here about do you have any comments to make on the potential anti-inflammatory effects of these medicines?
Yeah, I mean, there's really only one pharmacologist who has done serious investigation in that area that I'm aware of, and that's Chuck Nichols. And he discovered this effect initially with DOI, and he's now expanded the analysis into a much larger series of phenethylamines. And I don't know if he's published it yet, but his findings are very interesting in that the anti-inflammatory effect is uncoupled from the psychedelic effect. And so in that instance, it actually does seem like one aspect of the therapeutic property is not dependent on the 2A affinity. Yeah, so that's the biggest.
Some people said that that the toad medicine somehow has anti-inflammatory effects. I've also seen that mentioned somewhere. Have you seen that?
I have not seen any clinical scientific.
No, I don't know if it's clinical.
Yeah, I've heard people say things like that, but then you have to ask, how are they measuring the inflammation? And
Yeah.
it's easy to say something like that, but you need careful
research.
stuff. Yeah.
There's a question here about how does the HT2A receptor become blocked? Like, how would you know if it was blocked? Would this reduce your susceptibility should trips? Yes, well, it definitely would, Cindy. But how would you know if your receptor was blocked? Is there a way to know if your receptors are blocked?
Well, you might not know. But there, in this sort of research, there is a drug called ketanserin that is typically used as a semi-selective 5-HT2A antagonist. And so they administer, 25, 30, 40 milligrams of ketanserin that blocks all of the 5-HT2A receptors, and the psychedelic response appears to be attenuated or even blocked, depending on what research you're referring to. So, so you don't know, but that is how it is measured, at least in these sorts of experiments.
Fantastic. And then this question from Ben, I think I can answer this, but you may also want to extend on this, is how long is getting off SSRIs recommended before therapeutic dose? So usually it's recommended at least 2 weeks. Others people say at least 3 or 4 weeks. Obviously, you have to go through a proper weaning program. It's generally better if you do that under the supervision of a medical practitioner. Did you want to make any other comment about that question, Hamilton?
Oh, sorry, I keep looking at these.
No, I'll go down to them. We can go to the next question.
No, sorry. Say it one more time.
This was just about the question of weaning off SSRIs to...
Like, what is it depends. Different SSRIs have different half-lives, and it also probably depends. So you'd want to at least wait for the SSRI to have been excreted, which, depending on the SSRI, would be, maybe like 2 days, 3 days, something like that.
Well, they say a minimum of 2 weeks. Like, that seems to be the absolute minimum that people recommend.
Well, then it depends on whether you're concerned about a direct interaction with the psychedelic and the SSRI, or whether you're afraid that the residual effect of the SSRI will
still numbing it out.
Will attenuate the psychedelic effect, which is possible. So 2 weeks is probably fine. It is probably good for allowing yourself some time to normalize.
Okay, there are so many questions here. So we're gonna do quick questions, quick answers. So this is from Zoe, who says she's a huge fan. Could you comment on what ayahuasca DMT in clinical setting might look like? Any new breakthroughs in the research space that you know of around ayahuasca and DMT? Well,
there have been a lot of there's a good bit of clinical research on ayahuasca. It hasn't been done at any of the major research centers in the United States. I don't believe, I don't think Johns Hopkins is doing anything like that, but it's been looked at quite a bit in South America. And what would it look like? I mean, my concern with ayahuasca or any kind of botanical product in a clinical setting is just you have to be extremely careful about controlling the concentration of all of the different chemical components of the brew, and it introduces a lot of potential for variation that might make it hard to generalize the results. That would be my concern, especially when some of these ayahuasca admixtures contain 10 plus plants. So, I would feel more comfortable interpreting the results of something that were done, with synthetic DMT and maybe a carefully controlled dose of harmine or harmaline or both. And or using a completely different MAOI like meclobamide.
And do you think that, so with DMT and also Buffalo alveris, do you think that given the short acting nature of those particular experiences, do you think that they can have clinical effects, therapeutic effects on people, given, their 10 to 15 minutes perhaps experiences? By the way, that's not ayahuasca for those. just to differentiate, ayahuasca is obviously a much longer experience, but I'm talking about the shorter acting DMT or buffalo.
Yeah, short answer, yes, I do think that despite the very short duration of the experience, that that 5-MeO-DMT possesses all or many of the same properties as something like psilocybin. Obviously, the experience is very different, but I think a lot of the same benefits apply, which is interesting because the experiences are so different. But I think this is pretty commonly reported. I've experienced it myself, even though the duration of a 5-MeO-DMT trip is very short. You can feel altered by it for weeks afterwards. And so it does seem like there's a lasting and dramatic effect despite the short duration.
I thank you very much for that. Are you working on any upcoming shows? Someone said, how about a show, they're proposing show ideas to you. How about a show where famous celebrities, politicians, well, I'd also say, yes, definitely our Prime Minister and premiers and stuff, Fortune 500 CEOs try psychedelics somewhere legal and we see their experiences, like the YouTube Hot Ones series with foods.
They're pitching this as a show idea?
Yes, and they're saying if many of these high power people are psychopaths, according to research, then hopefully psychedelics might shift their consciousness. Wow, that'd be an interesting program, right? From the psychopath psychedelic sort of series, I can see it.
Yeah, I'm not going to make that show, but someone else can maybe. Yeah, and also I think this is based on the idea that all these greedy, bad people in the world, if they just used a psychedelic, they wouldn't be that way anymore. Like if Jeff Bezos took LSD, he'd, give away his riches to all the people in his factories, something like that. I would like that to be the case. It would be nice if that would be a reliable outcome of using psychedelics. But I think history has shown us that it is not quite that simple. Although I think, politicians should take psychedelics. I also am not opposed to the idea. I just don't know that it would instantly make them benevolent, compassionate people as much as I might hope.
Yeah. What's your favorite psychedelic? A few people are asking that one. I
don't have one. I think it's like, what's your favorite song or what's your favorite book? It's just, there's no honest way to answer a question like that. Different things are appropriate for different purposes, but I'm most interested in the unknown. I'm most interested in the things that have yet been discovered. So yeah, that's my favorite thing. Is just whatever I'm working on.
Do you think that these medicines are going to become available for healthy individuals to use in therapeutic settings like retreats and stuff? Obviously that is the case in Jamaica and Holland and other places, but what do you think about that for the US? And, I can comment on Australia, but what do you think is going to happen, and when do you think they're going to become available more for raising of consciousness and improving well-being, creativity, and so on?
Well, okay. It sort of depends on how things roll out legally. It would require not just decriminalization, but legalization, probably on a federal level, before anything like that would be really possible to implement on a large scale. In states like Oregon, a lot of people are opening businesses that I think are basically what you just described. So it does happen in a legal framework. And in terms of the entire clinical infrastructure of the United States is based on treatment of disease, or at least perceived disease. And so there is no therapy anywhere for anyone that isn't intended for people that have a disorder. So that in and of itself is already completely contrary to our entire medical model. So I don't think there will ever be an FDA approved treatment for healthy people, because it just is doesn't make sense. So yeah, but then, like I said, in a legal framework, people can make that choice themselves, and that will happen when things are legal.
Yeah, exactly. By the way, just to to all of you who are asking about sex and psychedelics, and we mentioned this at the beginning, literally just like 15, 20 minutes before this webinar was due to commence, Kelsey's son somehow jumped over a fence and broke his wrist really badly, so it was hanging off his arm. And so that particular sex and psychedelics webinar will take place in early 2022 as part of our global webinar series in 2022, and Hamilton will be back for that as well. So we're just letting you know that again. Just a question here about SSRI and MDMA. So the combination may dull the serotonergic effects. Is there still a risk or harm via hypothermic effects presented due to norepinephrine? I always get these norepinephrine activity.
They're asking about the interaction of SSRIs and MDMA.
Yeah.
There's a whole interesting story there that most of the literature on that interaction is flawed. Like it's like a chain. Someone made an interesting analysis where they went through the chain of citations and found that it leads nowhere. So but at the same time, I wouldn't be totally surprised if under some circumstances it's a dangerous combination. And yeah, so they're asking, it just, again, it depends on the dose of the MDMA and the SSRI and which SSRI it is. They're asking like, what was the question?
Hang on a sec, there's so many questions here, just one moment. About whether it may dull the serotonergic effects.
Will it double the serotonergic effects?
No, dull.
Oh, yes, yeah, it will. But it's not as safe. It's probably, even though I just said that thing about the chain of citations leading nowhere, I still think it would be irresponsible to suggest anyone combine the two without a lot of careful research.
Okay, thank you. People are asking, do you recommend taking these clinically or recreationally? Well, so I just need to say from Mind Medicine Australia, we can't advocate recreational use, but we understand that, people use these medicines recreationally. But obviously, we recommend that you always work with these medicines with the right intention and the right setting and the right dose. But Hamilton may want to add to that answer as well.
What was it? Recreational use, whether
recreational versus clinical use, yeah.
Oh, well, I don't really even think the distinction is necessarily meaningful to begin with. I think that a lot of so-called recreational use is essentially medical in some dimension. I mean, I think that a valid argument can be made that the only reason anyone ever uses any drug is because they are at least perceiving it as having some kind of therapeutic effect, even if it's not for a clinically diagnosed disorder. So, and at least in the United States, like you can get these diagnoses if you want them. It almost comes down not to whether you have it, but whether you decide you want it to be confirmed by a professional. Yeah, I mean, of course, I don't think there's anything wrong with people using psychedelics in a non-medical environment. Of course, it should go without saying, just as long as the real concern is just, this environment where things are impure, depending on what you're using. And most people don't have access to analytical instruments to verify the purity or identity of what they're consuming. And then the dosage concerns that arise in a market where you don't know exactly what you're consuming. So those are the issues with a recreational unregulated use.
Yeah, and we're seeing like in global drug surveys that thousands of people are using these medicines underground, I guess, to heal a variety of conditions. I mean, there's a question here from Robin that says, whether movements like MMA, MAPS and Compass and all those will make it easier or harder for well people to access psychedelics in their own home, which is often a very safe setting. I mean, I think the fact of the matter is, people are still going to use things in their own home, and we're certainly not against people using things in their own home. It's just not what our focus is. Our focus at the moment is on, how can we get these medicines to people who are mentally unwell. But obviously, once those patients get access to those medicines, that doesn't stop people continuing to use these medicines in their own homes. We hope that in time, there'll be retreat centres and, that people will be able to access these medicines much more like they do in the Netherlands, in countries like Australia. But it's just a matter of time, and we have to go through a particular process so that the medicines at least get recognised as medicines to begin with, which is the biggest challenge. But did you want to comment on that at all about, do you think that the current movement of this renaissance in medical use of these treatments is going to stop people using them in their own home? I don't think so at all. I think it will just, make people more aware of the medicines and hopefully get them to use them with more intention and in the right setting, the right dose and purity, right?
No, certainly not. I mean, it could hardly get any worse than it currently is. As things stand at the moment, not only can you not use in your home, you are committing a crime and could be arrested for it. So I don't think any medical validation of their use could in any way do anything but improve the current situation, because it is about as bad as it could possibly be. They're Schedule 1 drugs. They're in the same schedule as heroin in the United States. So, not to say that I even think heroin should be in this, by the way. I think that the whole system is totally flawed. But so yeah, things are bad. And I think any medical validation of their use, it makes it harder to keep them in a legal category that is defined by a lack of medical value. So that's one. I mean, again, this is dependent on the idea that any of this is reasonable to begin with, which it isn't. But yeah, there's almost nowhere to go but up. And the trend has been progress in both decriminalization, legalization, but also in the pharmaceutical industrial sphere. Yeah. And I don't think that they can be, I know that there's a concern that they will be adversarial forces, but if you look at what happened with cannabis, yeah, there was a little bit of that, but the dominant trend was one of dramatic liberalization of cannabis law in the United States. I mean, it's in New York, it is legal to grow cannabis. It's like, and I think that when you look at the progression, how did it happen? At one point, it's just all illegal. Then the FDA approves Marinol so there's federal use of THC as a therapeutic drug. Then you have a movement toward medical marijuana in New York, where a physician has to prescribe it, and you have to use a regulated vape and a regulated gummy of some kind, and then that's liberalized gradually, and then you get total legalization. So these things often happen incrementally. It doesn't happen overnight, as much as I wish it would. And that historically, especially looking at the trends that happen with cannabis, it's reasonable to assume that this is a stepping stone that will increase freedom for everyone. Yeah.
No, thank you. We agree entirely. There's a good question here, and we get asked this a lot. So there's been a lot of talk about governments trying to develop, or government or researchers trying to develop a psilocybin analog, which delivers the same therapeutic effects as classical psychedelics, but without the psychedelic experience, so without the peak experience. Do you think this is possible? Like, what's your thoughts on that?
I don't think it's possible, but I would love to be wrong. I truly would love to be wrong. It feels very unlikely to me, and I think that a lot of time and energy could be spent trying to solve a problem that isn't a problem in the first place. But also I get it. It's easy to hate on something like that, but I do get it. There's a lot of people who really wouldn't want to go through that type of experience, or maybe even can't due to certain types of mental illness. And so if you could confer the benefits of a psychedelic without a potentially difficult experience, I'm in favor of that. It doesn't make traditional psychedelics disappear for the people that want that. But my overarching answer is I don't think it's possible anyway. So it's kind of a moot point, but we'll see what happens.
Okay. A question here, there's loads of questions, so I'm just going to pick just a couple more. And thank you so much for answering these questions so generously. Diana says, look, can you provide any general or specific guidelines in terms of selecting a particular psychedelic for a specific application condition? So Diana, there's quite a lot of information on our website about that, but MDMA obviously is particularly used for PTSD and also addiction, psilocybin for a whole range of things. Hamilton, did you want to comment at all about what particular psychedelics you think particularly suit certain conditions?
No, I don't. I really don't.
No, that's okay. I thought you would. That's all right. Well, Diana, I mean, there's a lot of research and we can provide you with some great articles. So if you reach out to us, we'd be happy to share more on that. Okay, so what have been some counter arguments about against our claims of this research? Well, you know, the research is conclusive, Katie, but you're saying that every time you talk to older generations, their main argument against it is it's going to kill you. So the psychedelics are going to kill you. Now, Hamilton, I'm sure you can comment on that. I mean, how many cases have you heard of where people have had a pure psychedelic and it's killed them? Like, do you know of any examples of that?
Sure, yeah. It does happen. Not with the commonly used psychedelics, though. It doesn't happen with LSD or with psilocybin. With some things like bromo dragonfly or reportedly maybe with 2CT7, maybe 2CT21. Yeah, and you know, it's a broad class. And of course with ibogaine as well. And 5-MeO-DMT, there's some suggestion that there have been deaths. Let me think. There's the kind of dubious claim that John Griggs died of a psilocybin overdose. You know, that would be odd, but this is what is claimed on his death certificate. And
it's pretty hard to overdose on psilocybin.
Yeah, sorry, you're asking the wrong person because I've like really cataloged all of the instances that I'm aware of.
I mean, like, you know, like, you know, in all the trials, there has been, as I said earlier, no deaths, no heart attacks. You know.
Oh yeah, of course. In the yes, it's very safe. Yeah. I'm going out into the into
nature where it's unregulated and who knows what dose or purity.
Oh no! Oh yeah, these were overdoses. Without that's so yes, yeah. In a clinical trial where the dose is carefully controlled, it appears to be extremely safe.
And you can overdose on sleeping pills or Panadol. So, now there's a question here. Do you have any knowledge on mad honey or Grayan toxin containing honey rhododendron flowers? How are these hallucinogens different from classic psychedelics, such as psilocybin or LSD, etc.?
I'm not convinced that grayonotoxins are psychedelic or hallucinogenic in any. I'm sure you can find some reference suggesting that, but there's a lot of things that cause hallucinations that aren't really psychedelics. And it seems I've known people who've taken it and they didn't describe any kind of psychedelic type experience. They mostly said that it made them feel sick. So it's not something I have personal experience with. I'm aware that like from a cinematic visual perspective, the idea of this honey and how it's collected is very appealing. And I understand why people are interested in it, but I don't think that the pharmacological effect is as interesting as the surrounding story.
Okay, thank you.
Experiential effect rather.
Okay, thank you. Person here says, I'm curious about 5-HT2A receptor antagonist as rescue medications as a last resort when people on psychedelics have extreme agitation or self-harming, unable to be de-escalated. Some people say it's too jarring to suddenly be antagonized out of a journey, and benzos are better suited to the task. Did you want to make any comment on what the best rescue medication might be to de-escalate?
Yeah, I mean, historically, when people would go into an ER having a difficult psychedelic experience, they would give them a classical antipsychotic like haloperidol or something, which is a very unpleasant experience, even if you're not under the influence of a psychedelic. It's a very deadening kind of experience. It's not enjoyable. So that is undesirable. Then it seems that what happens now is people are usually given intravenous lorazepam or something like that, which seems to work a little better and it's less jarring for people. But in terms of like taking a specific, like a selective 2A antagonist to treat adverse reactions to psychedelics, I think it's worth a try. You probably would want to develop something that it was faster acting, or I don't know, a nasal spray or something maybe. And I have used ketanserin, and what's interesting about it is you might think, I'll also have to go after this, so I'm just going to answer this question.
No, that's okay. That's fine. Someone's asking, are you going to do?
Oh no, I was just going to say one quick thing about ketanserin that's kind of interesting is if you think about psychedelics have this spectacular effect and they agonize the 2A receptor. So then you might think, well, what happens when you antagonize it? Is it terrible? Does it make your vision black and white and destroy all the creativity in your mind or something like that? But interestingly, ketanserin is like almost non-psychoactive. It's even at like 50 milligrams, it doesn't really do anything. It maybe makes you ever so slightly tired, and it dilates blood vessels. So just little note, I've tried it myself, so I can tell you that's the case. It's barely psychoactive. So which is nice. It might make it actually good for that purpose. It's not like, giving someone naloxone when they're overdosing and they're dependent on opioids and they're jolted into some kind of horrendous withdrawal that sometimes is so severe that they end up using again immediately because they'd rather go back. So anyway, yeah, that's a long-winded answer.
Okay, have you got just a last question before you zip off? And for those, we're just going to wrap up with a couple of really exciting upcoming events that we've got, which we'll mention. Have you got another series of Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia coming up?
No, the third season was the last season. I just work in a lab now. I actually have to go back to the lab now.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for contributing and your support of Mind Medicine Australia. We're really grateful to have you on our advisory panel, and we may collect some more questions and send them through to you. There's so many there, and I will also have a look at a couple more of the questions and we'll finish this webinar. But thank you, and we're very grateful, and we'll look forward to having you at the summit, and then also you and Kelsey in 2022.
Okay, all right, thank you for having me.
Thank you. You're doing great work. Thank you. So just going to the gallery for a moment. I'm just going to have a quick squiz. If there's anyone that wants to put up their hand and ask a last question, we're happy to also put up your hand and hear your voices. I'd love to know what happened to snails in the garden eating San Pedro. That sounds like a great question. We'll just show you the final couple of slides of what's coming up now. So this is the summit, and we mentioned it before. We have the password special discount code MMA 2021, not with the hashtag, but that gives you a range of discounts for all the tickets. Ilan will put that in the chat, and we'll next slide. Thank you, Ilan. We also have a support service, so that if you are using these medicines and you need some counselling or support pre or post your sessions, or integration support, we have psychologists and psychotherapists around Australia who provide support and harm reduction services. So please reach out. Next slide. Tim Ferriss says, this next few years is an incredible opportunity to contribute more and really support this space. And there's many ways to help us. Next slide. So, we'd love you to share this content. We'll be sending a thank you a note out after this with lots of links. We've got a great learn section. We'd love to encourage you to talk to your doctors and medical professionals and explain what psychedelic assisted therapy is. Talk to your local MPs. Certainly fundraise or donate. Call us your charity of choice for your, your workplace lunches or events, and attend our events. There's so many ways to work with us and join our chapters and so on. Next slide. So yeah, please join your chapter or start a chapter. There's great like-minded people in the chapters you can get to know. Next slide, thank you. And we have a wonderful 4-part online course led by Dr. Trail Dowie and Nigel Denning. We just had the first one of those, had wonderful reviews about that course, and we'll be announcing some new dates for that shortly. Next slide. And this is our certificate in psychedelic assisted therapies. If you're a therapist out there or know someone who wants to work in this space, it seems like a lot of professionals want to be a psychedelic assisted therapist. So we really encourage you to enroll for this, apply. Well, you've got to apply and be selected for the course, but we also do have partial scholarships available as well. Next slide, thank you. So the rescheduling will be announced in December. Next slide. And we have some wonderful events coming up.